Salutations, Serene Eminence here. It's a pleasure to proceed with our second installment of the Courthouse Homicides series, involving the avenging mother, of whom took justice into the palm of her very own hands, via executing the executioner within the confines of the courtroom quarters. The lovely libation that shall accompany today's crime of reprisal is a 2022 Rukanga Reserve Chardonnay, curated in the southeastern region of Australia. The dry climate for which the white grapes were curated ensures for a maximum concentration of acidity, complexity, and creaminess. In accordance with content formatting for the Volatile Vocation Investigations channel, a criminal justice system briefing was offered, and volatility factors plus protective safety protocols shall be touched upon throughout this episode and beyond. Our initial episode covered the case of mass murderer and escaped convict Brian Jean Nichols, of whom committed to a homicidal rampage that stole the lives of 4 criminal justice personnel, including the presiding judge, a sergeant, a court reporter, as well as an ICE agent. As it pertains to volatility factors relevant to the Brian Nichols case, the shooting deaths of officials inside of a courthouse led to intense debate about the state of security in public buildings, especially inside of courtrooms. Subsequent to these indecent incidences, a 25-member task force proceeded to further investigate the pitfalls of the courthouse security system. Findings incited for the task force to announce the following key recommendations to improve courthouse security. Number 1, installing cameras in all courtrooms. Number 2, the assurance of employing 2 deputies proportionate in stature to escort high-risk inmates. Number 3, the utilization of proper restraints on inmates. Number 4, the use of special doors in courthouse holding cells that allow deputies to handcuff inmates before they enter the cell. In addition to the aforementioned recommendations, the Fulton County Courthouse Security Commission released an official report outlining security mistakes made on the date of the murder spree, including, number 1, the report found that the courthouse was severely understaffed respective to security personnel. While about 235 deputies were assigned to the courthouse, the report recommended that there be over 300 deputies on duty. Number 2, the report recommended that civilian bailiffs be used for administrative duties so deputies can focus on security. Number 3, it also recommended that panic buttons be installed under courtroom desks and that an emergency plan be formulated as a safeguard against a courthouse security breach. Due to the grave level of oversight, 8 Fulton County deputies were fired due to their actions during the courthouse shootings. 5 months after Nichols was indicted, the Fulton County Sheriff Department's internal review of the courthouse shootings was released. From a generalized vantage point, the sanctum of the courthouse is supposed to exist as the very quintessence of justice. And yet and still, irrespective of released reports, recommendations, and subsequent advised implementations, violence perpetually persists in this jurisdictional arena for a myriad of insidious reasons. To have such grave acts of injustice occur within the confines of a space committed to procedurally sanctioning criminals is explicitly ironical and unequivocally out of order. Even as paradoxical as this reality may be, in handling oftentimes oppressed offenders and rightfully disgruntled plaintiffs, it is pivotal to commune with the realization that the probability of insurrection shall inexorably exist as a potential risk that persists. Given the intricate interplay betwixt exacerbating factors, the problematic presence of arising violence within the courthouse will never be entirely extinguished, yet and still, all parties may play their part in committing to mitigative efforts. Due to the tremendous aggregate amount of nuanced detail attained, solely one comprehensive case shall be covered via the following video. The remainder quartet of Courthouse homicides shall be covered via the video compilation that follows. Respective to today's case, in an act of vigilantism, Marianne Bachmeier premeditatively shot and killed Klaus Grabowski, the rapist and murderer of her 7-year-old daughter, Anna Bauchmeier. The melancholy moments leading to the murder of Anna, the sadistic criminal history from the vantage of perpetrator, and resulting death of Grabowski from the vantage of victim, as well as the particularities related to Mrs. Bauchmeier's punitive motive, shall all correspondingly be addressed. Prior to officially proceeding, I would like to extend my sincerest condolences to the families and all individuals impacted by the loss of these precious lives that I shall be extensively discussing. May the unique legacies of all individuals mentioned via this video live on through the contents of the Vocational Volatility channel, and evermore exists within the hearts and memories of those of whom cared for them most. Disclaimer: viewer discretion is advised. Sensitive topics such as graphic depictions of violence and sexual assault shall be discussed moving forward. Please cease your viewership if you are uncomfortable to any degree with the aforementioned mature matters. Now let's proceed to unveil the intriguing interrelationship betwixt warranted vengeance and resultant resolve amidst this retributive case. In relation to the location, the country for which this crime occurred was in that of northern Germany, particularly within the medieval-style city of Lübeck. With around 216,000 inhabitants, it is the second largest city on the German Baltic coast and is the 36th largest city in Germany. One of the most massive maritime disasters ever to occur took place in the Bay of Lübeck amid the closing days of the Second World War. It caused the deaths of more than 6,000 concentration camp prisoners on May 3, 1945.
The SS, sensing that Allied troops were drawing closer to the Neuengamme concentration camp, moved all the prisoners still able to walk to the city of Lübeck, a German port on the Baltic Sea. There were around 12,000 of us, and the vast majority were Russian prisoners of war. In Lübeck, the prisoners were loaded onto barges and, heavily guarded by soldiers and boats, moved along Lübeck Bay to the Baltic Sea, where there were 3 vessels waiting for them, 2 small and 1 large, on the 3rd of May 1945.
Respective to the exact coordinates of the homicide, the crime of reckoning unfolded inside of the District Court of Lübeck, where rapist and murderer Klaus Grabowski was shot several times in the back and rightfully perished upon the cold floor of courtroom number 157. As it pertains to the date, this avenging act transpired amidst the spirit of springtime transfiguration on March the 6th, 1981, exactly 1 year and 3 months after the tragic transition of Marianne's daughter Anna, which took place on May the 5th, 1980. When speaking of the exact time, on the 3rd day of Klaus Grabowski's trial, at approximately 10 a.m., he engaged in a deadly dance with justice and met his maker all in the same instance. Now let's speak on Marianne's easeful apprehension by officials and subsequent charges. She was indeed arrested the same day as the homicide took place, which was of course on March the 6th, 1981. Mrs. Bauchmeier was initially charged with murder, but the charge was reduced and she was ultimately convicted of premeditated manslaughter, as well as unlawful possession of a firearm. In delving deeper into sentencing and the development of court proceedings, prosecution had a tough task on their hands in the case against Mrs. Bauchmeier. She could not be pardoned because once the courts offer impunity towards one vigilante killing, anyone and everyone could proceed to take the law into their own hands in the name of vigilantism. However, There was a lot of pressure from the public to have mercy on her. Mrs. Bauchmeier was released soon after her arrest, but was taken into custody on the 14th of August because law enforcement received information that convinced them that she was a flight risk. While in custody awaiting trial over the span of about 15 months, she attempted to take her own life 5 times. Doctors and psychologists called for her release, fearing that she would suffer irreparable mental and spiritual damage. In its totality, Mrs. Bachmeier's trial lasted 25 days, and she was sentenced to 6 years in prison. She was able to walk out of the courtroom as a free person, as she was only required to go to prison at a later stage. Marianne was put on suicide watch and spent the first 18 months of her incarceration in a psychiatric facility. She was released in June 1985 after serving 3 years. She remained on parole for 2 years and 10 months. According to public opinion regarding the sentence, some felt the punishment was too harsh, while others felt it was too light, wherein 28% of citizens felt that the sentence was appropriate. 27% reckoned it was too harsh, while 25% felt she got off too lightly. The remaining 20% were undecided. Respective to the overarching modus operandi, the theme of vigilantism is at the forefront. She ultimately moved forward with the execution as a means by which to avenge the sickening violation and attempts at slander associated with the saddening death of her daughter. As iterated verbatim shortly after the slaying, Mrs. Bachmeier told the courtroom judge that was present, "I wanted to kill him. I wanted to shoot him in the face, but I shot him in the back. I hope he's dead." In her official statement, she wrote, "I did it for you, Anna." She included 7 hearts to depict the 7 years of Anna's life. When further examining the vigilantism angle, vigilantism is defined as the act of preventing, investigating, and punishing perceived offenses and crimes without legal authority. This case caused an international media frenzy. 2 main points stood out among public opinion. The first was that individuals sided with Marianne Bachmeier, stating that she did the right thing by taking the life of the man who confessed to abducting, raping, and murdering her 7-year-old daughter. The second opinion was that she should not have killed him because he was due his day in court to defend himself, although he had made a very thorough confession to investigators and offered the same during 2 days of court proceedings prior to his death on the 3rd day of the proceedings. Now, in further examining the personal vendetta angle, from the invaluable vantage point of a forensic psychologist, she very well may have been deeply moved by the desire to thoroughly eviscerate the spirit of successive sexual assault. Thus, in a twofold manner, exacting unmitigated justice respective to her daughter's torturous ordeal, as well as in tertiary relation to her very own traumatizing experiences as a rape victim, possibly embodying the unconscious motivation of ceasing cycles of sexual assault, thereby preventing future women and young ladies alike from being assaulted yet again by this vicious repeat offender. Mrs. Bachmeier's daughter was indeed the 3rd and, thankfully, last young lady to be victimized at the hands of the aforementioned perpetrator. Respective to the cessation of malicious cycles, this act of exacting vengeance against a perpetually wicked perpetrator is reminiscent of a film pre-screening that I was invited to. The film was officially released in the year of 2022 and was entitled The Watcher. The plot was as follows. A young American woman moves with her husband to Bucharest and begins to suspect that a stranger who watches her from the apartment building across the street may be a local serial killer, decapitating women. Towards movie's end, the protagonist oriented herself in a sacrificial position so that she may stealthily deceive the antagonist into the grips of his very own demise. In surviving the ordeal, she arose as a tried and true testament of a noxious timeline annihilated, and was subsequently able to extricate some semblance of justice for the previous lives that were senselessly lost to this unsavory cycle. Now let's reveal more reverent details regarding the perpetrator. Of course, the perpetrator's name was Marianne Bachmeier, also known as the Revenge Mother or the Avenging Mother. She was strikingly stunning with a temperamental yet magnetic personality. Born a Gemini, she was birthed on June the 3rd, 1950. Her day of death was September 17, 1996. As it relates to her life subsequent to release, Ms. Bauchmeier moved abroad before returning to Germany after being diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She died aged 46 and was buried next to her daughter, Anna, in Bergtor Cemetery in Lübeck. Amidst her early life, Marianne grew up in the small town of Sarstedt, situated in West Germany, where her parents had fled after World War II from East Prussia. Marianne's life was purportedly punctuated by hardship. She was raised by an authoritative father, of whom had been a member of the Waffen-SS, which was the military combat branch of the Nazi Party's parliamentary Schutzstaffel organization. And when her devoutly religious and conservative mother divorced her domineering father, she was then raised by her abusively tyrannical stepfather until she was kicked out of the home by her very own mother. By age 16, she had her first child and subsequently placed the infant up for adoption. 2 years later, the very same scenario was made manifest, wherein she placed her second infant up for adoption as well. However, a differential of this scenario was that prior to the birth of her second child, Marianne was reportedly raped by an unknown assailant at a disco. When speaking of the victims of this case, the most prominent is that of Klaus Grabowski. He, of course, initially operated as the perpetrator that victimized Marianne's daughter, Anna, which ultimately etched his future-most fate as a murder victim into his gravestone. He, of course, officially perished on March the 6th, 1981, at the age of 35. He was a neighbor of Mrs. Bauchmeier, which situated him in close proximity to prey on Anna Bauchmeier. As it pertains to employment, Grabowski was a butcher by trade. The skills learned via his profession ultimately influenced the way in which he tied Anna's body up prior to burial. Respective to his life and criminal history, Klaus Grabowski was a balded bearded man, of whom was well known in the community and among law enforcement. He was charged with attempted murder and received a probation sentence in 1973 for strangling a 6-year-old girl, of whom luckily was able to evade his wicked attack. During a second assault, just a couple of years later, he sexually molested 2 9-year-old children. Statements extracted from a psychological evaluation were indicative of the following. The board is undoubtedly certain that the abnormal sexual instinct of the accused is addictive. The accused was aware of the unauthorized activity, but he was considerably limited in his ability to prevent it because of his addiction to the offense. In 1976, Klaus Grabowski was sentenced to spend time in a psychological treatment facility for sexually abusing the 2 girls. And as a part of his rehabilitation, he was chemically castrated. Grabowski was given a choice. If he agreed to the chemical castration, he would be released. If not, he would have to remain at the institution for an extended period of time. He agreed to the former, and thus the procedure was performed, and he was released shortly after. However, there was no follow-up treatment nor integrative help offered. At this crucial point, he should have had more psychological care in tandem with hormonal treatment regimen. 2 years after his release, Grabowski visited a urologist and requested hormone treatment. That was to reverse the castration. This treatment was approved by the court because he reported physical side effects. He also had a fiancée at his side, and they wanted to start a family. To the court, it appeared as if the treatment was successful and that Grabowski had turned his life around. Grabowski had lied to the urologist about receiving mental health support, and the urologist did not follow up. He later admitted that he knew nothing about Grabowski's past and only treated him from a hormonal point of view in the aftermath of castration. His neglect to inquire about Grabowski's criminal record would ultimately come back to haunt him after Anna Bachmeier's murder. As it relates to the secondary victim, also known as the catalyst to the actual homicide of Mr. Grabowski, Mrs. Bachmeier's daughter was of course named Anna Bachmeier. Marianne gave birth to Anna at the age of 22 on November 14th in 1972 in Lübeck, Germany. Marianne reportedly had herself sterilized abruptly after Anna's birth. Anna's date of death was that of May 5th, 1980, at the age of 7. Reportedly, when 29-year-old Marianne Bachmeier was informed about her daughter's death, police felt that Marianne's reaction was rather strange. She did not want to speak to police and refused to go to the morgue to identify the body of her daughter. Police had never experienced a reaction like this and did not quite know how to approach the situation. At Anna's funeral, Marianne made sure it was everything but a traditional religious ceremony and arranged for a Pink Floyd song to blast loudly amid the church. Anna's early life was not punctuated by as much hardship as that of her mother, but was still indeed a bit rocky. Anna was reported to be a happy and free-spirited young lady, which was akin to Marianne's temperament. Anna's father, Christian Berthold, volitionally chose not to be involved in the pregnancy nor Anna's upbringing, aside from sporadic visits here and there. As such, Marianne was raising Anna as a single parent. Mrs. Bachmeier worked late and long nights as a waitress in Lübeck, and it was reported that Anna literally grew up inside of the bar for which she worked. Her only forms of escape were rare visits to the countryside with her father, or playing on the cobblestone streets, engaging with the neighbors, and playing with their pets. Now let's proceed to unpack the cause of Anna's death, which served as the incident that ultimately sparked the murder of the perpetrator. Anna Bachmeier was abducted, raped, murdered, and hogtied by Klaus Grabowski. Whilst on trial, he stated verbatim, "I heard something come out of her nose. I was fixated. Then I could not stand the sight of her body any longer." Respective to the actual timeline, on the morning of May 5th, 1980, Anna was reeling from an argument that transpired the previous day with her mother over wanting to see a friend of hers instead of attending school. Her mother did not approve, which prompted Anna to become angry. Ultimately, out of spite to her mother, Anna took it upon herself to leave home and pretend to attend school. Amidst pretending, Anna was lured into the apartment of neighbor Klaus Grabowski with a promise that she could play with his cats. Yet the agreement was nothing more than a ruse that led lovely Anna to the dead end of never leaving the home alive. Inside the confines of his apartment, Grabowski sexually assaulted Anna for several hours before strangling her with a pair of his fiancée's tights. He tied her body up utilizing skills he had learned in his profession. Grabowski placed Anna's body into a cardboard box, loaded it onto his bicycle, and buried her body along the bank of a local canal in a shallow grave. When his fiancée returned home from work later that afternoon and learned what her future husband had done, she immediately contacted the police. Investigators discovered Anna's remains and arrested Grabowski for her abduction, rape, and murder. Once arrested, Grabowski stated that his fear of going back to prison was what prompted him to murder Anna. In further contextualizing this homicidal incident, as well as the unfurling timeline, whilst on trial for the death of 7-year-old Anna Bachmeier, Grabowski testified that the young lady had attempted to extort him with the threat of telling her mother that he had assaulted her, stating that he killed her because she had threatened to tell her mother of the attack unless he gave her money. Grabowski said that he became angry and fearful. If she was to report him for molesting her, he would go back to jail and his fiancée would leave him. He was not about to lose everything. Who did the little girl think she was, threatening him like that? On March the 6th, 1981, the third day into Grabowski's trial and exactly 1 year and 3 months after the death of her daughter, Marianne Bachmeier took personal offense towards Grabowski's allegations regarding her child. During an interview in September of 1995, she admitted that she had shot the alleged killer of her daughter after careful consideration to enforce the law on him and to prevent him from further spreading lies about Anna. Marianne, who had suffered abuse before from a violent father and stepfather and being the victim of sexual assault in her teens, was infuriated about this. To shame the victim, especially a young child, was inexcusable. As if it weren't already horrific enough that Mr. Grabowski's sexually sadistic and addictive nature caused for the actual murder of Anna, he took it a step further via slandering the name of Mrs. Bauchmeier's daughter, implying that she actually provoked the attack. And it was this very act of slandering the name of Anna, in tandem with his attempts to lure himself out of imprisonment, that led to his slaying. Now, if it was of Miss Bauchmeier's initial intent to exact revenge for her daughter's murder via executing the perpetrator, I do believe she would have acted upon this instinct nearly instantaneously, and thus it would have been more of a reactionary crime of passion instead of a more premeditative act that was ultimately provoked by the attacks on Anna's character. Now, it can be argued that Mrs. Bauchmeier always held the intent of executing the perpetrator. It's just that she required more time to plan how she would conceal the weapon and enter the courtroom so that she may execute him. However, during this time, around the 1980s in Germany, there was no specific security clearances nor metal detectors required for individuals to walk through prior to accessing the courtroom quarters, so thus a plan to conceal was not necessary. It was actually reported that Mrs. Bauchmeier secured the gun from a customer of the bar for which she worked at, and Mrs. Bauchmeier secured it for her own safety purposes. Subsequent to the death of her daughter, she began to feel increasingly unsafe, and she actually stashed the gun at her daughter's gravesite, hiding it nearest her gravestone. And when keeping in mind that Germany had actually abolished the death penalty, it was quite literally up to Mrs. Bauchmeier to take justice into the palm of her very own hands via slaying the perpetrator within the courtroom quarters for the character assassination of her daughter. As such, on a cold, rainy Friday, Mrs. Bauchmeier proceeded to secretly carry a .22 caliber Beretta 70 pistol in her purse through the courthouse directly into an active courtroom. There wasn't a lot of people in the courtroom, as the doors only opened to the public 5 minutes before the start of the session. Klaus Grabowski was led inside from a side door and taken to his chair in the dock. He sat down with his back to the entrance. She turned around and calmly walked over to where Grabowski was sitting. With the short distance of only a couple of yards between them, she pulled out the .22 caliber Beretta from her purse, aimed it at Klaus Grabowski's back, and opened fire. She fired 8 shots, of which 7 hit her daughter's murderer in the back. He had no chance of survival and simply slumped over on the desk in front of him, then fell over onto the courtroom floor, dying moments later before a doctor could make it to the scene. Marianne threw her firearm aside and gave herself over to an officer of the court without any resistance. At this point, she reportedly said, "I wanted to shoot him in the face. Unfortunately, I hit him in the back. I hope he's dead." Marianne's ex-boyfriend, Anna's father, Christian Berthold, witnessed the incident and muttered, "She did it. She actually did it." It was an eye for an eye justice that the public felt could be justified due to the nature of Grabowski's crime. Ironically, because Grabowski died in the course of his trial, he had not yet been proven guilty, so in the eyes of the law he died an innocent man. In terms of Marianne's stance on justice and remorse, she verbatimly stated, "I can't imagine that I would have shot this person if he had turned around and said that he was sorry about what he had done. She regretted that it had to happen, but she did not regret doing it. It's significant that she never showed any remorse. She never had a moment where she came out and said, 'What have I done?'" I hope that you all thoroughly enjoyed the unfurlment of this avenging mother's case. Assure to remain tapped in to community posts and YouTube shorts so that you may gain exclusive first-hand access to case updates prior to uploaded comprehensive case coverage, as well as nuanced information regarding serial killers and the death penalty. Amid the interim of uploading the quartet of Courthouse homicides, you all assure to stay safe, stay stealthy, and stay serene.
Vor 4 Wochen begann hier im Gericht der Prozess gegen die schöne Marianne Grünwald. Nach langen vorgerichtlichen Auseinandersetzungen